Welcome to another video here at Back to Classics, and today we're going to feature this 1973 750 Sport. As you can see, completely restored, now nearly finished. Just the testing and adjusting phase is ahead of us. At least it's finished for now, before we take it on the road and probably make a next video about this bike when it's actually driven. But for now we thought about making a video focusing more on the history of the 750 Sport and how it all came about, and more specifically on this particular bike, what we did and how we did it on this occasion. So first let's dive into the Ducati history once again and go back to when this bike was launched for the first time in 1972 in fact. So going back even further than that, we have to start with the first incarnation of the Ducati 750 V-twin that was first introduced in 1971 on the 750 GT. We can show some pictures of some early models. It's a bike we featured also in a previous video where we actually took one of these 750 GTs, very early type, sandcast model on the road. And well, that 750 GT, of course, always with Ducati, there has to be some link to racing, and that racing soon began as soon as the bike, the 750, was thought of by Fabio Taglioni. It was already clear that racing was the next step. So they undertook that right in 1972, entering in the Imola 200-mile race there. Very, very successful, winning the race, and also the second place and the first two places for Ducati, effectively making a name for Ducati in the big displacement motorcycle industry. But that's perhaps also a subject for a separate video at some point. At least the sporting heritage of Ducati made it so that the 750 was also entered into racing, and that of course has to be translated to a road model as well. And that first became, after some prototypes back in 1972, the Ducati 750 Sport that featured the wide 750 GT frame still, and that had a slightly different painting scheme than on the later models. Because of the wider rear frame, it also has a wider rear seat unit, a wider frame where the front mount is, where the mount over the frame is a little wider, a different painting scheme incorporating a Z, which is why we call it a Z stripe, and some other minor details. Engine was different from the 750 GT that was available at the same year, in the sense that it had black painted covers, both sides, as well as the some additional parts for the cylinder head and the bevel tunnel, so to speak. But apart from that, it had a slightly higher compression on the pistons that were different from the GT, and it had a set of Dell'Otto PHF 32mm carburetors instead of the then used AMAL 30 carburetors on the GT. So it was a mildly tuned version of the 750 GT engine that the 750 Sport came about with in 1972. Very, very few of these Z-stripes were made. We call them Z-stripes today, obviously because of that specific styling on the fuel tank. These 72 Sports, very few. We think perhaps 50 in total were made in 1972. So very rare, very sought after bike. We did restore one a few years ago. We can definitely include some pictures of that restored bike. That will explain a little bit more about the specifics on that 1972 model. But production really caught on in 1973, and that is what we see here. This is actually one of the very first 1973 model 750 Sport, and there were a few changes, actually quite a lot of changes to be made in 1973, and the biggest was the frame that now was much narrower around the seat. something that came out of the racing history, because these Imola bikes also had a narrower frame than the 750 GT had at the time, obviously making it more suitable as a racing bike with a narrower seat so that the driver could move about a little bit more. So that was completely new for 73, this frame. This frame also was the basis for the models in the future. So we see the same narrow frame on the 750 Super Sport, albeit in a different color and with some brackets here and there changed, but in the basics, all the same, up to up to the last beveled twin Ducati, the Mille, that still had effectively the same geometrics from the frame as it has on the 750 Sport. So other changes for 73 were a new painting scheme. You can see, you saw in an earlier video on these 350 Desmo how the single cylinder yellow Desmo lines of 250, 350 and 450 Desmos were linked by Leopoldo Tartarini to the larger capacity 750 Sport, effectively creating a sort of a small brother, so to speak, of the 750 Sport, with more or less the same painting scheme. So that was changed as well for 1972, as we see. Sorry, for 73, as we see here. But apart from that, it had still more or less the same specifics. Engine-wise, it was all the same, as well as the front fork instruments were all shared with the 72 model. That went on into the final year of the 750 round case, which was 1974. Okay, so for 1974 there were minor changes. In fact, it was the last year of production for the 750 round case before it was replaced by the square case 860 of 1975. Again, basically it was the same bike as it was in 73, albeit that the black engine covers were now polished, like they always were on the 750 GT and on the Super Sport of 1974 as well. And other changes were very mild. There were upgrades to the front fork, in the sense that it received a center axle rather than leading axle front fork. I can show you some pictures of the changes they did in 74. And that also meant that with the Seriani front fork, that some of these 1974 bikes had a Seriani front fork, and they also came with Brembo braking system rather than Scarab that was used on the earlier bikes. So again, basically the range of sports, there were mild changes between the production years, 72 to 74. But basic layout was the same throughout the history. So that about the history of the 750 Sport range. Let's dive into this particular bike a little bit more and tell you a bit more about this, about the background. So this particular 1973 750 Sport, we have this bike in our possession for many years, and it had been crashed at some point, and that showed with some damage to the frame, the front fork, and a lot of other bits, and it was all packed in boxes, and we think it had been stacked that way for many years. So gradually over time we restored this bike. Starting in fact with the engine that was completely newly built, so the cases were all wet blasted, as well as the cylinder and the cylinder heads. The crankcase was completely rebuilt, as well as the gearbox. It was completely put together and with new pistons that were newly bored and honed to the cylinder. Cylinder heads had new valve guides, new valve seats, new valves obviously, so it's been completely rebuilt to the highest standards, as well as the carburetors that are the original PHF 32 millimeter carburetors, also completely rebuilt and good to go. Then for the frame, because of the bike and the history it had as a crashed bike, the frame was in such a bad state that it could no longer be used again. So we used one of our own production frames for this bike. It's a completely new frame. that has been made with our 3D technology. Again, we can show you some pictures of how we do that. So the frame is, from a geometric point of view, even from the position of every little single bracket that you see on the frame, is a mirror image of what Ducati used back in that era. So completely newly made, newly painted, obviously in gloss black, and with the engine fitted. That was a big milestone achieved in this restoration project, because now finally, since we believe somewhere in the 1980s, this was the first time that engine was actually fitted to a frame. Apart from that, the front fork was completely restored, again newly painted in wrinkle finish black that you see there, and all newly built with new internals and new fork stanchions, triple clamps as well, painted in the correct wrinkle finish black. Rear shocks are the original 1972 version of the Marzocchi rear shocks that has these ball adjustment, as we call them, the ball adjustment shock of Marzocchi. These were newly built as well, completely restored and fitted to the swing arm and the frame. The wheels, we sourced an original set of Borani wheels, the correct number Borani wheels, front and rear. As you can see, these inscriptions, we think somewhere in 1973 Borani used a slightly different typography on how they imprinted the rims with their name and the part number. And as you can see here, these are the early version of inscriptions. So correct for the 1973, early 1973 bikes used to have this type of inscription. So these were newly spoked wheels with new grey painted spokes. Brake system is also the original single-sided SCADA brake system, also rebuilt completely, also functioning well and all good to go, with new tires, obviously a set of Dunlop TT100. We feel is the most appropriate tire we can get for the 750 Sport, and period correct as well, because they were also available in the 1970s. Bodywork is completely new. This fiberglass fuel tank is molded from an original one, and in fact the same process we use on all our fuel tanks, so is made with a resin in the fiberglass that is resistant to ethanol. So this can actually be filled with petrol and used. Same goes for the mud guards, the swing arm, the seat and the side covers, that are all new and newly painted. And the front fairing that you see here is an optional extra that was available throughout the 750 Sport life. It's an optional extra in the sense that it's also a bolt-on, bolt-off, so there's no extra bracket to attach to mount the headlight in a different position. It's all done in the way that it can be removed easily, but also fitted easily. But this is something, it's also all completely new, but it is made from an exact mold, made from an original fairing, as well as the screens were all done in-house, so to also have the optional fairing available again. So we, for this instance, we fitted this fairing because we like the looks of it so very much on this 73 750 Sport. Well, what else? Electrically, it is also 100% original. Original Aprilia headlight with JOD reflector. Original left-hand switch, original instruments by Veglia. These 1973 and also the 1972 models have the electronic rev counter fitted instead of the later mechanical ones. There is one upgrade that we did on this bike, and that is the ignition system, which is a fully electronic digital ignition system. In fact, the one that you saw me adjusting in the video we made as a tutorial on how to set up the ignition system of these more modern digital ones. So that is something that is non-original on the bike. Other than that, it is completely completely original from start to finish. All bodywork, of course, painted, newly painted in the correct yellow. So this brings us to the stage of this project it is now in. Of course, we need to take it out on the road to have it completely finished, test it, adjust it, and completely done. But for that, we have to wait for some good weather to come our way. So that'll be probably early spring before we can really finalize this project. Perhaps you can join us there when we make a video about when we take this bike actually on the road and drive it. That's for the next time. So that concludes the video for this time. We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching. Toodle-dokie, and see you next time.